Hi, I'm Eric, and I host the Paperback Warrior podcast and contribute to the blog right here at paperbackwarrior.com, where you can find hundreds upon hundreds of reviews of vintage fiction and access over 100 episodes of this very podcast. I'm finishing out the spooky season here at Paperback Warrior. I hope you've enjoyed all the horror reviews and content we've posted this month. On November 1, we're going to get back to high-octane adventure, action, western, crime fiction, and so forth. Now, today's episode contains a feature on the most popular horror author of all time outside of Stephen King. That man is Dean R. Koontz, and I'll provide you a little personal connection to Koontz, provide a brief overview of his life, and dig into all of the series titles and various pseudonyms he used in his career. In addition, I'm going to have a companion video attached to this podcast episode that you're going to find over on our YouTube channel. It's going to rank my favorite Dean R. Koontz horror novels from number 20 down to number 1. That video is a smorgasbord of awesome vintage book covers with different editions of the books throughout the years. So please check it out because the video took me days to create and I don't want my hard work to be wasted. I'm selfish like that, you know. But seriously, the YouTube channel has exploded. I have shopping trip videos up there, shorts on book reviews, authors, just all sorts of stuff posting there weekly, if not daily. Also on this podcast episode, I've got some new books to tell you about and a review of a classic horror novel. Maybe you've heard of this one. It's called Bram Stoker's Dracula. Also, at the end of this episode, I'm going to be reading the story Weasels Ripped My Flesh, which I'm going to elaborate on in just a second. But first, I wanted to do a little thank you to the show donors these past few weeks. Their generosity is greatly appreciated, and I wanted to take a moment to thank them. So sincere gratitude going out to Ida Umphers, Bob Dice, James Seeger, Peter Robel, KR Training, Derek Wallace, and David Kowalski. I also wanted to say thanks to some authors and publishers that have expressed an interest in Paperback Warrior, whether it's this podcast, the blog, the reviews, and so forth. Whatever it is, I get feedback from these fine folks, and they just keep me updated with new books and so forth. Big thanks to Starkhouse Press and Greg Shepard. I correspond with Greg occasionally through email, and he's such a great resource for paperback information. Also, he keeps me on tap with books galore, and I appreciate that. Additionally, Lee Goldberg, who's also a wonderful resource. Anytime I need to archive a newspaper article, he's quick to provide it. I mean, he is a best-selling author, and he's in the movie business, and he still takes time out for lowly me, and that's something special. I'm also kept in the loop on books being issued by his Brash Books Publishing Company, and his Cutting Edge Books Publishing House as well. Also, a big thanks to Stephen Mertz for always being there for me. He's another excellent resource for book and author information. He's a great friend and terrific writer, and he's one of the reasons Paperback Warrior exists in the first place. I also really appreciate author and editor Paul Bishop, who's another excellent resource on books and publishers. He's been a great supporter of the show, and I really value our friendship. Also, I really appreciate the folks at Wolfpack Publishing and Rough Edges Press that always make their books available to me. Even though we don't cover too many contemporary books, they're always there for me, and I do appreciate it tremendously. The gentleman I mentioned earlier, Bob Dice, he's also one of my closest supporters and is always just a click away from providing me resources on men's action adventure magazines, cover artists, publishing information, magazine history, and so forth. He's a great friend. He keeps me in the loop as well on everything that's happening with the MAM quarterly magazines and the men's action adventure library books that he edits, writes, and contributes to. Plus, my wife loves seeing Facebook photos of his lovely wife and all the tasty cocktails she drinks on Fridays. So there's that. I also wanted to say thanks to Claire Viggers for recently reaching out to me with some recommendations on books. Also Michael Soroy for his recommendations on Alfred Hitchcock and the 3 Investigator books. Also thanks to Will Murray as well, the amazing writer of contemporary pulp fiction, for assisting me recently on a question I had about a pulp author. And I also love Audrey and Rich over at Bold Venture Press. Also a thank you to Steve Hockensmith, Jarrett Keene, Matthew John, and Terrence Lehue for sending me some of their books recently. And a big thank you to Scott Rouse, who's promised to buy me lunch the next time I'm in Detroit. I've never been to Detroit, but for free food, listen, I'll fly anywhere. Alright, so out right now is the 2024 edition of the Men's Adventure Magazine story and art anthology, Weasels Ripped My Flesh. This was first published as a black and white edition back in 2013, which I own, but this new version is an upgraded edition with better quality cover and interior scans, including additional scans and artwork, plus there's special sidebars that weren't included in the original publication. The book is available in both softcover and deluxe hardcover editions, and those are available on Amazon, and in the US it's also available through menspulpmags.com. So that's exciting news, and man, I love all of those creature attack books that Bob and Wyatt collaborate on. It's really awesome. To celebrate this book's release, again, I'm going to read the title story from this book, Weasels Ripped My Flesh, at the very end of this episode, so be sure to stick around for that. More new stuff coming out. Starkhouse Press has 2 books for November listed so far. The first is Ghost of Society by E. Philip Oppenheim. It was originally published in 1908 and features an intro by Curtis Evans. This is sort of a vigilante type of novel with these 7 bright individuals that decide to form a little gang to right wrongs, rob from the rich, and then contribute the spoils to needy hospitals. But they unfortunately rob the wrong man and all hell breaks loose. The other November book from Starkhouse is The Nuremberg Papers by Jonathan E. Lewis. Now, this is a contemporary novel set in the 1980s and features a private detective named Mike Levinas who becomes entangled in an international mystery when he's hired to find a client's missing husband. So be sure to look for both of those next month. Bold Venture Press will publish their newest issue of Pulp Adventures. This will be issue number 46 and has a salute to King Kong. It'll release on November 8th. Also from Bold Venture Press on November 8th is a brand new The Destroyer book. Imagine that. It's called Fresh Blood and features 12 new short stories based on the Remo Williams character. The authors that are included in this book are Warren Murphy, Will Murray, James Mullaney, Mark Ellis, and Gerald Welch, among others. You can also get this in paperback, hardcover, and ebook. New from the Rogues in the House Presents podcast is a new book by Matt John titled To Walk on Worlds. It is described as collecting nearly a decade's worth of dark fantasy and a fistful of new stories printed here for the first time. I like the blurb on the back here. The blurb says, "From the burning isle to the hellish depths of Zanzara, beyond the demon-haunted planets circling the Black Rim, only Maxis the Meddler may walk on worlds, and woe to any other who tries." This is out now in both ebook and paperback as well, and I should have a copy of this in the mail pretty soon, so I'm looking forward to reading it. Okay, now that I've cleared our plates and beverages, let's get down to some tasty dessert. I'll turn on some dining music for us right now. Okay, to serve up the feature today, I need to tell you about 3 childhood friends of mine. As many of you know, I grew up in the Bible Belt in a small town in Virginia. I didn't really have a neighborhood. My closest neighbor was an old woman who never had water or septic at her house. Like, seriously, she would pump her own water from a hand well that was on our property, and she carried these stainless steel buckets of water through a little trail or pathway through the woods back to her house. She also collected rainwater from her roof in a cistern to use for, I really don't know what she used it for. Anyway, the point is, I had no one else around except my buddies. Their names were Stephen King, Dean Koontz, and John Saul. They spent long summer days, or snow days, with me on the back porch or inside in my room under a lamp, just chilling. Seriously, I spent a lot of time reading these authors, and I'm sure some of you did as well. Stephen King was really my first horror author that I read, but Dean Koontz was right there around the same time. So the closest city to me was Roanoke, Virginia, and when I was a 7th grader in middle school, Roanoke got a Sam's Club. It was a big deal. This was around 1991. Up until this point, none of us, my parents included, had any idea what a Sam's Club was. And I can remember going in there with my parents and just the shock and awe of all this food. Then I found the book aisle. And back then, Sam's Club had a ton of books. I remember like it was yesterday, my parents went over to the frozen food section and they just left me in the book aisle to just go completely nuts. I think at the time I was probably searching for a Stephen King book or something, but I saw Dean Koontz's Cold Fire hardcover book and it had just been released. I mean, this thing had new written all over it. The cover was amazing with these blues and purples, and there was a lighthouse on it, which was really a big thing for me. I love lighthouses. And the synopsis on it sounded great because it mentioned something about an old farm and something supernatural affecting the main character. I was thinking, maybe this guy's like Stephen King or something like that. But the problem was, the book was $23 new, and even with the Sam's Club discount, it still made it like $17. I had no birthday or Christmas money left, and my allowance was typically between $5 and $10. My parents were used to me buying the Hardy Boys books, or my dad was buying westerns, and those books were only like $4.95 or something. $17, way out of the question. But I was able to convince my parents that I really, really needed an advance on my allowance in the worst way, and that this Cold Fire book may change my life forever. And it sort of did. So Cold Fire wasn't the greatest book ever, but it was still pretty darn good. I then went down this rabbit hole at my local library and found more Dean Koontz. I even discovered that they had his books at the high school library when I landed there as a freshman. And I know you're sick of hearing about my childhood at this point, but one more quick thing. Each summer, my parents drove to Arizona in a small, compact Toyota Corolla. Now, I was an only child, so I had the entire back seat to roam, which was pretty darn small. But that was 3 straight days of interstate driving with very little air conditioning and hot, sticky vinyl seats. But I always brought my stack of Dean Koontz paperbacks with me on these trips, and I can vividly remember sitting in the back seat reading The Voice of the Night, The Mask, The Face of Fear, Whispers, and so forth. How do I remember all this? Because I still have all of my Dean Koontz paperbacks and hardbacks from my childhood, and somehow memories can just link up to the books you read at that moment in time. Isn't that weird? Anyway, that was my introduction to Dean R. Koontz, and I think that serves as a pretty good introduction to the feature on this author. So Dean Koontz was born and raised in Pennsylvania. His father was an alcoholic, mentally ill, and unstable. His dad had over 30 different jobs and put the family through this horrible hardship. Koontz was close to his mother, and she died when he was just 21 years old. He graduated from Shippensburg State College, where he won a fiction competition there sponsored by Atlantic Monthly. He was later employed as a type of social worker communicating with underprivileged children in the Appalachian area. He eventually started writing nights and weekends and moved on to become an English teacher. Now, Koontz really wanted to be a full-time writer, and his wife, who was also his high school sweetheart, gave him an awesome offer. She told him that he could quit his job and write full-time for 5 years. She told him if he couldn't make it in 5 years, he'd never make it. After 5 years, his wife had quit her job just to run her husband's booming new business. He was a full-time novelist. See, that's what I'm talking about. I've been writing the same book for decades because my wife refuses to allow me a 5-year break from working. If she would just agree to move into a cardboard box with me under a bridge for just a few years, we could totally make it off of her job income alone, and I could write novels and make millions of dollars off of movie options. So back to Koontz. So his first venture into publication was mostly concentrated on science fiction and fantasy. The novel Star Quest was his first book, and it was published in 1968 as part of an ace double with Doom of the Green Planet by Emil Pataja. I'm not sure if I'm saying that name right. Koontz followed this with more ace double titles, including The Fall of the Dream Machine and Fear That Man in 1969, and then Soft Comes the Dragons and Dark of the Woods in 1970. Now, Koontz had 11 books published by Lancer between 1970 and 1973. 5 of these books were written under the pseudonym of Deanna Dwyer, and they're all Gothic romance novels with titles like The Dark of Summer and Legacy of Terror. The other 6 Lancer novels published during this time were science fiction or dark fantasy. Now, he also had a novel published by Curtis in 1971, Bantam in 1972, and Dahl Books in 1972. He also continued with Ace as well with another novel in 1972. Also, in 1972, Random House published what I would like to think of as the very first traditional Dean R. Koontz novel. It's called Chase. What I mean by that is a book that fits his niche of suspense-filled thrillers or horror. The book was written using the pseudonym of K.R. Dwyer, which abbreviated is just Koontz's initials backwards. Koontz was 25 years of age upon the book's publication. This short novel was later revised by Koontz and issued as part of the Strange Highways collection, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, Tom Simon had the opportunity to read and review the novel. He said it's about a young man named Ben who has just returned to the U.S. from service in the Vietnam War. He became a sort of local celebrity in his hometown for winning the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, Ben is suffering from PTSD and spends his time in a rented room drinking whiskey and watching old movies. On a late-night drive, Ben parks at a lover's lane sort of spot and comes to the aid of a couple teens who are attacked by a mysterious, creepy guy in the woods. The creep kills one kid, but Ben's able to save the other kid. Ben's heroism is thrust into the front pages of the local paper, but this creepy guy escaped, and he's now calling Ben and stalking him. Tom really enjoyed the book and said it's a basic suspense novel and a social message on the psychological cost of war and the way the Vietnam War veterans were treated on the home front. Again, the book is called Chase, and it was originally published under the pseudonym K.R. Dwyer. Now, 1973 was a very productive year for Koontz. He had the aforementioned Lancer publication, but also 4 more books were published. Using the pseudonym K.R. Dwyer again, he writes what I consider his second traditional Koontz novel. The book is called Shattered, and was also published by Random House just like Chase. It was also reprinted in the 1980s with the Koontz name attached to it. This is sort of a take on those road rage horror type movies such as Joyride, Duel, Road Games, and so forth. So a guy named Alex marries Courtney, and together with her young brother, they travel from Philadelphia to San Francisco. But along the way, they begin being stalked by a psychopath driving a van. You know what our parents told us about strangers in vans. Well, increase that paranoia by like 100. This is one long chase, and the narrative is pretty tight and convincing. I love the relationship the two had, and it was almost like they were parents to Courtney's brother because he's really young. He's like 9 or 10 years old or something like that. Of course, the suspense is finding out who the driver is. This one was really enjoyable. And I also love the 1980s artwork for the paperback with that guy looking in the rearview mirror. You've probably seen it before. Also in 1973, Koontz was able to get his sexy military comedy, Hanging On, published by M. Evans. I've heard mixed reactions to this book and I've never read it. Supposedly it has graphic sex and is filled with hijinks during World War II as soldiers operate behind enemy lines. The covers always made me think that this was some sort of tie-in book to the MASH television show, so I've always passed on it. But this is a standalone book. I've never read it. Also, in 1973, the first of a 3-book series was launched. The series is unofficially titled the Mike Tucker series, or what fans refer to as the Black Bat Mystery Series. The 3 books were Blood Risk, published in 1973, Surrounded in 1974, and The Wall of Mask in 1975. All 3 novels were authored under the name Brian Coffey and were published by Bobbs Merrill. Now, these are crime fiction heist novels that were probably an homage to Donald Westlake, Lionel White, or Dan J. Marlowe. The books star an art dealer and professional thief named Mike Tucker. In the first book, his crew ends up stealing from the mafia, which puts them in the crosshairs of the syndicate. The second book features Mike Tucker robbing a shopping mall in Santa Monica, but then becoming trapped inside when police surround the place. In The Wall of Mask, Tucker's in Mexico to steal an ancient wall of exotic mask. I've never read these books, but I've never met anyone who had anything bad to say about them. From what I can gather, they're just average heist novels, nothing more, nothing less. Also on his crime fiction kick, Koontz also wrote a crime novel titled Strike Deep in 1974 under the pseudonym of Anthony North. This book features a crew breaking into the basement of the Pentagon. The book is supposed to feature some really forward thinking on the part of Koontz for its early use of data hacking. Again, I've never read this book either. Koontz continued his science fiction writing in 1974 and 1975 with 2 books, and then The Long Sleep in 1975 using the pseudonym of John Hill. The Long Sleep was published by Popular Library, In 1975, Berkeley published Koontz's science fiction novel Nightmare Journey. Also in 1975, Koontz sees his science fiction / horror novel Invasion published by Laser under the pseudonym of Aaron Wolf. Now, this book would later be revised by Koontz and published under his own name as Winter Moon in 1994. In this novel, a guy named Jack and his wife and kid inherit this large ranch in rural Montana. Some sort of telepathic and physical force, maybe aliens, invades their minds and cuts off all communication during this heavy blizzard. The force then becomes a creature, and the family must fight for their lives. I thought this book was great, and I loved the panic of being trapped in a snowstorm with this invading malevolent force. I have no way of comparing Winter Moon to Invasion because I've never read the Invasion book, but I assume the two are very similar. Now, the K.R. Dwyer name is used again in 1975 to author the book Dragonfly for Random House. I haven't read this, but the synopsis sounds great. A Chinese nationalist is carrying a biochemical agent that will kill hundreds of thousands of people and set off a war with China. I heard the book was just okay. In 1976, Koontz's homage to High Adventure was published. The book is called Prison of Ice, and it was written under the pseudonym of David Axton. Now, this book was also revised and reprinted in 1995 as Icebound using Koontz's name. The premise is kind of nuts. This salvage boat is trying to tow an iceberg, which is going to be used to provide water for droughts. Seems silly. The salvage boat gets stranded, and then there's this assassin on board. I don't know. I haven't read the book, but I've never really heard anyone speak negatively of it. Now we get into what I consider the best era of Dean R. Koontz's career, the late 70s, the 80s, and 90s. Night Chills was published in 1976, and it's a straight-up horror novel about a town being affected by a government facility that's creating mind control to sway citizens into outrageous acts of violence. It was followed a year later by another traditional horror novel titled The Vision. This one concerns a psychic who helps the police find serial killers. She starts to gain knowledge about an upcoming murder, and there's some mystery in there with her husband possibly being a homicidal maniac. Koontz's 1977 book, Face of Fear, was authored using his crime fiction pseudonym of Brian Coffey. Remember the same name he used on those Mike Tucker heist books. Now, this book is really interesting. Essentially, it's about a man named Graham and his girlfriend Connie that are both trapped in a skyscraper with a killer nicknamed the Butcher. The idea of being locked in a skyscraper, or at least a very large building, with killers trying to find you may sound familiar, right? If it doesn't, here's 2 words. Die Hard. Now, Die Hard was based on a book titled Nothing Lasts Forever, which featured a retired detective named Joe Leyland attempting to save his daughter from terrorists that have invaded her office inside of a skyscraper on Christmas Eve. See some similarities? I know it's a stretch, but I really loved The Face of Fear, and I loved all the cat and mouse stuff as the couple ran from floor to floor and all the office spaces trying to hide from this killer. They also run this elevator gauntlet just trying to avoid him. This was also adapted into a made-for-TV film in 1990. The Key to Midnight was published in 1979 by Pocket Books, with Koontz using the name Lee Nichols. I haven't read this one, but supposedly it's about a woman singing in a Japanese nightclub that may actually be a senator's missing daughter from 10 years ago. Conveniently, she has amnesia, and she can't remember who captured her. In 1980, Whispers was published by Putnam Berkeley. It's about a crazy guy who keeps breaking in and attacking this girl named Hillary. She ends up teaming with a detective, and they investigate the guy's background with the very real possibility that he's dead and how he may have had a homicidal twin. I really liked this book. Also in 1980, Koontz breaks out the Brian Coffey pen name again to write The Voice of the Night. This one is about a new kid in town who innocently befriends another kid his age. Then he learns that this kid he befriended is really a psychopath that wants to rape and kill. Again, I like this book as well. I thought it was really, really disturbing. Also in 1980, The Funhouse was published with Koontz using the name Owen West. So this book has a really strange conception. Koontz was provided a screenplay for the film The Funhouse, being directed by Texas Chainsaw Massacre director Tobe Hooper. The film wasn't released until 1981, but Koontz's novelization of the film was published a year or at least several months prior to the movie, so it felt like an original novel. What's not to like about this book? I love carny stories about the people who work on traveling carnivals. There's a guy who's a Satan worshiper planning on impregnating this teen girl with the Antichrist. I mean, seriously. The teen then gives birth to the creature, and then she kills it. Decades later, the same teen now has a kid of her own that gets pregnant. The mother's afraid that the teen will birth another awful creature that could, in fact, be the Antichrist. It all revolves around murders that happen in the funhouse while the carnival's in town. It's just a crazy, crazy book, and I'll confess I've never seen the movie, but the book is over the top and goofy enough to actually be enjoyable. The Mask was published a year later in 1981 and also used the name Owen West. By the way, most of these late 70s and 1980s books with pseudonyms are all reprinted with Koontz's name on them now. They reminded me of what Jack Higgins did once he became a household name, just reprinted all of his books with that billion-dollar name. The Mask has a couple that can't have children inviting a child into their home in hopes of fostering her or maybe even adopting her. But she could be a psycho, or she just has psychos from her past. I like the book, and I really like the mystery behind the girl. In 1982, Koontz used the Lee Nichols name again to write The House of Thunder. This was a really cool book with a woman with amnesia being held prisoner in this mysterious hospital. I really, really love this book. Now, Phantoms was published in 1983. This is what a lot of people consider to be his best book. Folks, this book is freaking terrifying. So, the main characters are two sisters, Jenny and Lisa, who have returned to their hometown in snow-filled California. This place is tiny and it's in a remote area in the Sierra Nevada mountains. When they arrive in town, they discover that the entire population has vanished, aside from a few bodies that have all been torn up or have a strange sort of death associated with them. Also, the town's phones and I think the power, it doesn't work either. This was before cell phones, people. This is really a thick atmosphere of dread in town, with these sisters being the only living people for miles. Eventually, they get to a phone outside of town, and a sheriff arrives along with a biohazard unit. The reason for the murders and disappearance of the population is a Lovecraft sort of Ancient Ones type of deal. Listen, this was just an extraordinary novel. There was also a film adaptation that I thought was really good for the film's first half, and then it just simply fell apart. Again, the Lee Nichols name is used in 1984 for Dean Koontz to write Twilight. This book would later be reprinted under Koontz's name as Servants of Twilight. It's another good book that concerns a crazed cult trying to capture and kill this boy that they believe is the Antichrist. This was also a movie. Darkfall was published in 1984 by Berkeley. I've heard this book is great. I've never read it. I've often had it in my hand to read throughout the years, but for whatever reason, I've just never read it. It's about a detective in New York who's investigating savage murders that may be originating from a monster living under the city. Twilight Eyes was published in 1985 by Land of Enchantment Books. This thing goes for big bucks now. It was illustrated, but the book was reprinted as a mass-market paperback by Berkeley in 1987. This is a fantastic book, and a lot of people point to this one also as Koontz's best novel. If you've seen John Carpenter's film They Live, then this is sort of in that style. A carnival worker can see goblins that are appearing as humans. He travels the carnival circuit so he can kill the goblins. Of course, to everyone else, it appears that he's just killing innocent people, so the law's after him. Kind of reminded me of when people were running around killing vampires. To everyone else, it just looked like they were killing humans, so it's kind of on that same take. The main character can throw daggers, so that element was really cool as well. Again, this was just a fantastic novel. The Door to December was published in 1985 using the pseudonym Richard Page. The premise was a girl who had secret experiments performed on her, and her mother's trying to find out more information about it. I've never read it. Strangers was published in 1986, and it's about a group of people that converge at a desert stop called Motel Tranquility. There, they learn that all of them have something in common from their past that may include secret government experiments. I've never read this one either. I think I've started it a few times throughout the years, but I just never got into it. Watchers was published in 1987. Once again, a shadowy government operation conducting business in a top secret laboratory that have somehow allowed their genetically altered creatures to escape. This was also made into a movie starring Mark Singer from the Beastmaster movies and also the V television show. In 1987, the expanded version of Twilight Eyes was published. In 1988, Koontz saw his time travel novel, Lightning, published. It's about a girl who has a repeated guardian come into her life at different times over a 30-year period. I love the book. It was really good, and of course it has time travel, it also has romance, and it has espionage set in World War II, so a really diverse novel. Midnight was published in 1989, and I really enjoyed this one also. It kind of works like a werewolf novel, but it's really just humans that turn into ravenous, savage people due to some kind of weird lab experiment. Listen, Koontz loves his lab experiments, his dogs, his women on the run from secret government operatives. These are all in his novels and stories, and it's one of the reasons why Dean Koontz takes a lot of flack from readers and fans, because he recycles the same thing over and over. In 1990, The Bad Place came out. In that book, a guy wakes up and discovers he may be killing people in his sleepwalking or in some type of unconscious state. I've never read that book. Shadow Fires was published in 1990, and I believe this was a novel that Koontz had originally started as Lee Nichols, but it was reprinted with Koontz's name on it. It's a decent book about a woman on the run from secret operatives, obviously. Cold Fire was published in 1991, and we briefly talked about that one earlier. I really liked it. It sort of has like a drifter feel to it as the character kind of drifts along and ends up in, I think it's Maine or California or something, and there's like an alien presence. Hideaway was published in 1992. Features a guy who dies for a few minutes, is resuscitated, and then has a psychic link with a serial killer. It was made into a movie as well, which I hated because Jeff Goldblum was in it, which I also loved the movie because it had my teen crush Alicia Silverstone in it. She's gorgeous. I didn't love this book, though. I'm going to sort of drop off here and just do book counts. There's just too many books to get through on this episode. Koontz's hot period lasted throughout the 1990s, where he had 16 novels published, either new books or reprints of earlier novels using his household name, with just a few standalone books thrown in. Here's some of the series titles, including a series from 1998-1999. The Moonlight Bay series was a 2-book series published from 98 to 99. It's about a guy who suffers from a rare disease who stumbles upon a government conspiracy at a military compound when his father dies. There's also the Odd Thomas series, which ran from 2003 through 2015, and it featured 7 total books plus 3 graphic novels. Now, this series is sort of like a Ghost Whisperer Sixth Sense thing, where this short order cook can see ghosts, and then he goes out and attempts to solve the mysteries surrounding their deaths. I read the very first Odd Thomas book, and I didn't care for it. I just never could connect with the character, and I just thought the whole idea was kind of silly. A movie was also based on the series debut. The Frankenstein series was 5 novels published between 2005 and 2011. This is sort of a serial killer thriller set in New Orleans with a guy named Victor Helios, who was once Frankenstein, attempting to stop the engineered killers he's brought to life that are murdering people in New Orleans. I've never tried the series. I believe there's also graphic novels or comics associated with this series. There's also the Jane Hawk series, which lasted 5 novels from 2017 to 2019. The series may sound familiar. It's about a woman who's mourning over her husband's suicide when she stumbles upon a conspiracy created by a secret society that have evil intentions. I've never read it. Nameless is a series of ebooks that ran 6 installments in 2019, which were called Season 1, and then another Season 2 consisting of 6 more installments. These are crime fiction ebooks about a vigilante who travels the country fighting corruption. His past is a mystery, who he is and what his real purpose is. I've never tried these books. The Makani trilogy of books was published as novella ebooks and also 1 audio-only installment. These coordinate in some way with another novel of Koontz's called Ashley Bell. I don't know anything about these books. So Koontz has managed to put out at least 2 books per year his entire career. He's still writing, and he even has a new book coming out next month called The Forest of Lost Souls, followed by another book in May titled Going Home in the Dark. Now, an interview I read in LA Times had an interesting tidbit about Dean Koontz. He explained to the reporter that he does not have the internet. He uses a computer with no internet, and at the end of a day of typing, he saves his work to a floppy disk, which I honestly think is probably a thumb drive, and Koontz is just calling it a floppy disk, and he walks it down the hall to his assistant. He also says that to this day, he still prints out all the pages he typed that day, puts them in a bag in the freezer. He does this in case of a fire. It's weird and somehow it seems admirable. I don't know why. At the time of the interview, he had moved from a 28,000-foot house to a 7,000-foot house to downsize. I did like in the interview how he condemned the wealthy people. We're talking about like uber rich celebrities and writers and so forth, on how they continue to be arrogant in thinking that just because of their social status or their money, that they can just fix all the world's problems. Koontz is still married to his high school sweetheart. Her name is Gerda. They had no children. They've donated millions of dollars to Canine Companions for Independence. They're really big on dogs, and they're dog lovers. There were 17 total films that have been adapted from Dean Koontz's work. I thought it would be fun to do this. Here's some popular myths about Koontz, some true and some aren't. Did Koontz write for the television show Chips? Yes, he wrote 1 episode using the name Brian Coffey because the editors butchered the episode so bad. Now, the Library of Congress, or the Copyright Office, have, quote, verified, unquote, that Dean Koontz wrote a porn novel titled Hung, using the name Leonard Chris in 1970. Koontz has repeatedly denied this claim and has asked for proof from the Library of Congress on where their sources lie in incorrectly verifying Koontz wrote this book. However, I couldn't quite grasp whether a different book titled Hung was actually written by Koontz and then altered so much by an unauthorized publisher that Koontz now claims the book isn't his because of all the changes. I really couldn't get the full story behind Hung. If you know the story, let me know, but it was a mystery to me. Black River was never a novel. This was originally a pitch for a movie that Koontz contributed to with a teleplay writer that was bought by the Fox network. This was to be the beginning of a proposed series of 2-hour movies about a creepy town. Fox ordered that Koontz write a novelette to serve as the basis of the first 2-hour movie. This novelette appeared in Ed Gorman's Mystery Scene. The movie was awful, and the network backed out of the movie deal, and that was it for Black River. Darkness Comes isn't a different novel than Dark Fall. They're the same book. Koontz never used the pseudonym of Shane Stevens, and despite book dealers claiming they have secret books written by Koontz as Stevens, they're all false claims. Koontz was never Shane Stevens. Koontz doesn't make many public appearances. He's really a private guy, and I totally respect that. Anywho, I hope you enjoyed this feature on Dean R. Koontz. My source was the Dean Koontz website, which thankfully has a detailed dive into Koontz's books and also a separate section just for collectors. I also used the Collecting Koontz website and ChristyNNelson.com blog. Again, be sure to visit the Paperback Warrior YouTube channel to view my top 20 ranking of Koontz books, including capsule reviews of those books with tons and tons of covers. Okay, on to Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is probably the earliest book I've reviewed here on the show or even written about on the blog. Dracula was written by an Irishman named Bram Stoker, and it was published in 1897. It was a huge success and the most popular horror novel of all time. Although 50 years from now, I think that honor is probably going to be heaped on Stephen King's It. I see Pennywise everywhere. Pennywise is like the new Dracula. But anyway, Dracula kicked off a ton of media, from movies to television shows to action figures and even to breakfast cereals. Dracula is often the icon for vampires. Now, this book is presented in a non-traditional way. The entire book is made up of diary entries, letters, transcripts of phonograph recordings, telegraph messages, and ship logs. The presentation begins with Jonathan Harker's diary entries. He's an attorney who's been asked to travel to the Carpathian Mountains in Transylvania to visit Count Dracula at his castle. The meeting is to settle some financial affairs and to finish up some real estate purchases. However, Harker quickly learns that he's become a prisoner and he's only able to communicate with his fiancée Mina through letters that are read and approved by Dracula himself. Harker also discovers that Dracula is a supernatural being when he sees the Count behave like a lizard and crawl down the castle walls. There's parts of the castle that are restricted, but Harker's able to discover 3 vampire women that are also in the castle as well. He also discovers a cemetery and a chapel where the Count sleeps in a dirt-filled box. Now, Harker eventually returns to England and is admitted into the hospital where he tells Mina everything that's happened. Meanwhile, the Count has purchased an old house in London and arrives by boat in a mysterious fashion. Then, through diaries and letters, readers are introduced to Lucy, who's Mina's friend. Lucy begins to behave in strange ways, and readers quickly discover that she's a victim of Dracula, evident with puncture holes in her neck and her telepathic connection with Dracula. Dr. Seward, who is also seeing strange behavior in a patient named Renfield, asks for help from his mentor, Dr. Van Helsing, who determines that Lucy is a vampire. Together they collaborate with other men to find Dracula's home. Eventually, horrible things happen to Lucy, and the book's finale has Van Helsing and the other men chasing Dracula through the snowy mountains, battling gypsies to kill Dracula. First off, for 1897, this book is violent, like extremely violent. We have women having their heads chopped off, garlic stuffed into the mouths of corpses, there's a baby that's kidnapped and drained of blood, there's children dying, like really out there stuff for this time period, which I guess probably led to the book's success. The book's beginning with Harker in the castle was just fantastic, and the last 60 pages is really good with the mystery determining Dracula's whereabouts and the impending chase. The problem is the middle 200 pages, which is the bulk of the book. The constant perspective changes from diary entries of one character to physician notes or letters of another character, and the rotation, it just never glued me to the story. Also, Van Helsing is pretty freaking lame. He cries a lot. He speaks like he's a character in Shakespeare. He's just way too literary for me. These 200 pages read like a medical thriller with these blood transfusions and just endless around-the-clock care for Lucy. I'm not sure I would really say that the book is scary, but there's some scary moments, or at least some highly stressful tension in segments of the book. I wish Dracula was a traditional novel, but I know that its wide appeal is the style of which it's presented with these various forms of communication. Some people love it, others are just underwhelmed by the book. Overall, I'd say I really enjoyed Dracula, but I'm probably never going to read it again. I'm one and done just because of the sluggishness of the middle part of the book. But if you like horror, then Dracula is a mandatory read. You have to read it, or else you really can't substantiate your love of vampire literature, or something like Salem's Lot, for example. I also want to read The Vampire by John William Polidori, which was published in 1819. But ending of this review, I will also say that my reaction to Dracula may also be skewed due to my love of all those Hammer horror movies that I watched as a kid and still watch, and the 1992 film by Francis Ford Coppola. I think if I hadn't seen the movies or anything like that, this book would have had a huge impact. Anyway, that's my review of Dracula. Next is our final part of this episode, which is me reading you a story called Weasels Ripped My Flesh. If you don't want to listen to the story, you can back out now. Be sure to check out paperbackwarrior.com's blog for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reviews. Be sure to check our YouTube channel. Subscribe if you haven't done that already. Weasels Ripped My Flesh by Mike Cammons. I was sprawled on a mound of hay, shotgun cradled in my arms, and my head drooping fiercely from want of sleep, when that first ripple of alarm surged through the duckhouse. Instinctively, my finger curled on the trigger as I slowly sat upright, blinking at the soft amber glow of the kerosene lamp suspended from the rafter. I heard nothing. Only the breeders shifting timorously in their pens and their quacking. I had 2 loads of 4s in the shotgun and a spare double dose in my pocket in case of trouble. Fox, skunk, bobcat trouble. I felt good when I brought the gun up and lined it along the rafter, waiting and praying for a shot. Then I saw movement, silhouetted against the rafters, rapid and distorted, and I stared incredulously as 2 pinpoints of sheer fire suddenly loomed down at me. I squinted at the animal for a long moment, and when, an instant later, another appeared directly behind it, and I saw the undulating tail and streak of white running down the center of its breast, I knew the cause of my headaches. Weasels. In 2 nights, 90 ducks lost to these murderers. I was so mad, I didn't think to look at the drop boards and see more weasels scampering over a pitchfork towards me. At least a dozen of them, big ones, a foot long, and they hit me at the precise moment. I squeezed the trigger. Something tore into my right leg, clawing and biting me so that the shot deflected downward, striking the kerosene lamp. Rivulets of flame coursed along the hay as I fell to the floor, screaming and smashing my fist against the hideous furred body. I saw flesh and blood rip loose as I pulled it off of me, and then the duck house became a pyre. For as long as was humanly possible, I tried to smother the flames. I tried despite the fact that weasels were clinging to my clothes and crawling up my back. I could smell the sickening odor of burning fur and hear the piteous lament of the trapped ducks, but I couldn't get them out because I was rolling on the floor ripping weasels off my face. It was 1954, a day after Hurricane Carol, and we were still without electricity. That's the equivalent of a man in a gun battle with no gun. Incubators die, freshly killed ducks go bad, and all the vermin in the world have a field day in the dark night. Without electricity, the small company which I owned was speeding unalterably towards bankruptcy. I knew it, yet there wasn't a damn thing could be done but pray that they'd restore power in sufficient time. My farm was on the east shore of Connecticut, convenient to the hurricane, but somehow, miraculously, it had been spared. Naturally, a few shingles had gotten blown off and a hunk of roofing went flying, but on the main we were lucky. We, my wife, Mary, and I. Actually, we were lucky in several respects. Because of the holiday weekend, Labor Day, I'd sold most of my freshly killed ducks. There was damned little left except some reserve stock and the ducklings-to-be still in incubation, plus the livestock. We were lucky, until the weasels, I mean. The first night of the weasel trouble, we were so beat up from trying to keep the roof on the house, I slept right through the frantic quacking that meant 60 dead breeders. Mary broke the news gently the following dawn. "Mike, here's a cup of coffee. You'd better get up." "Time is it?" I mumbled groggily. 6:30. Joe's back from the feed. He's downstairs in the kitchen, waiting. For what? I said, leaning up on one elbow and sipping the coffee. More bad news? You're psychic, Mike. What? Tell me gently. A lot of dead ducks. Something got into the breeder house last night. Joe found a fair-sized hole, he said. I nodded, gulped the coffee, dressed, and went down to the kitchen to talk with my foreman. Joe Haynes and I had been friends for a long while, since the Army to be exact. I knew Joe and Joe's thoughts before he did, I think. He and I and 2 pluckers made it a 4-man operation with Mary doing the cash registering and bookkeeping. It was a small outfit, only a year and a half old at the time. Fox? I said, nodding. Don't think so, Mike. Looks like maybe a big cat of some sort. Maybe a mink or a family of skunks. Maybe a weasel. Can't tell for sure. Whatever it was, he went through that house like, "Let's go," I snapped. Might as well see the worst now. 30 yards from the house, Joe nodded at the fencing. He speculated some of the wind might have ripped holes along the bottom of the meshing. I suppose I said you're right, or something. I don't remember. I was sick at my heart and in my wallet, where it hurt more. All that season we'd had predator trouble. The usual thing, rats, skunk, even a bobcat or 2. I expected to find the usual collection of half-eaten ducks, but I was wrong. Of the 60 dead fowl we'd counted, only 3 had been chewed apart. The balance had been killed for the sheer love of spilling blood. "No lights, Mike," Haynes sighed. "Bastard got in here and had a ball. Kerosene lamp didn't faze him a damn," I nodded dourly. "Let's see where he got in." So we looked for more than an hour. We checked the whole length of the duck house. On our hands and knees we covered every bit of running floor space. Nothing. Then Haynes took the ladder to the roof and checked there. Nothing. "Come on, Joe," I called finally. "I'll figure something out. We've got other work to do." Rest of the day, I and Joe and the boys got the farm squared away as best we could without electricity. Mary drove into town to plead with the electric company, and they told her there'd be service maybe that evening. Maybe we'd be in business after all. But evening came and the power was still off. I swore upside down I'd hock my soul for an independent motor generator system. After dinner that night, I walked down to the ducks and checked 6 lanterns I'd hung over the pens. Then I went back to my gun rack. I was still putting on my jacket, figuring it'd be a long night's vigil sitting in the hay, when one of the hands came charging up. "Mike, something's got in the house a few minutes ago." Right when my back was turned, it had come again and ripped the throats of another 30 ducks. And so it was that I was well on my way down the drain. I'm not saying that 90 ducks would break us, but 90 in 2 days, and how many more after that? Feel? How did I feel? I wanted to crawl into the ground and pull the lid over me. So I'd gone down that third night, still no electricity, and stationed myself in a corner of the duck house, the big 12-gauge double-barrel cradled in my arms, waiting and praying for a shot. And the murdering devils returned for more, and now I had them lined in my barrels. But it didn't quite work out as I'd planned. Not now it didn't. Now the barn was a roaring inferno with hundreds of ducks cooking alive, and I was being ripped to pieces by foot-long weasels, their bodies wet with my blood. In the stark reflection of the pyre, I could see them running out of the duck house. I clawed great fistfuls of wet hair from my legs as they pulled on the others, already tearing me to pieces. I shrieked as the pain burned my flesh, but I stumbled back to the duck house and found the pitchfork. Then, like some poor demented animal, I began spearing everything that moved before me. I saw the long double-pronged steel gouge through squirming bodies. 1, 2, 4. I was out of my mind with pain and grief, yet I didn't stop skewering them even as I drove the pitchfork into my own leg to stop them. I was soaked with blood, gushing down my face, blinding me, staggering around like a madman, and shrieking at the top of my lungs, jabbing with that pitchfork until I thought my arms would come off. Behind me, the heat of the Holocaust singed my hair. I could smell burning feathers. I could hear the weird din of roasting live duck, and it sickened me. I turned for a moment and stared at the barn, then turned around again and drove the pitchfork into the shining white breast that was smeared with my blood. My hands were torn to pieces every time I stopped to claw at some part of me being attacked. I had to drop the pitchfork in those moments, clubbing and tearing with my bare hands. I'd get one, and another 2 would hit me from behind and start raking my face. Time after time I'd drop to the riverbank and roll over trying to smother them, but they'd squirm out from under, their fetid breath full in my lungs, fainting like boxers for a new attack. I caught a weasel under his throat and dropped the pitchfork and held onto his neck with both hands, squeezing until the narrow mouth popped open and the tongue slid between the bloody mouth. I squeezed until his body went limp, then turned and heaved it fully into the fire. The sound of my voice screaming, "Mary!" was like an insane person's, and no doubt I was insane at that point. My body from the skull down felt as though hundreds of hot pokers had been driven into the skin, driven there and held by some devilish horror which I never believed existed in real life. And then it happened. I began to feel queasy from loss of blood and that terrible panic in my heart. I couldn't hold the pitchfork, and I couldn't stand. The ground moved and knocked the wind out of me, and I began rolling. I felt hairy bodies racing over my face. I clawed one from my cheeks and tried shielding my face. My blood, the taste of warm human blood, excited them still further, and the weasels drew back in a cluster to drink it from my clothing. I felt a hairy tail cross my face, and I opened my mouth and bit solidly on a leg. I heard a squeaking sound in my vagueness and opened my eyes to see drawn fangs gnashing before me. I lurched and missed and crawled to my knees and began moving away. Vaguely, I heard my wife's voice above the roar of the nightmare. I screamed as I fell again, my chin banging against the handle of the pitchfork. But it didn't knock me unconscious. It reminded me I was still in the world of the living, and if I wanted to go on living, I'd have to get up. I did, and the nightmare continued, but there were less of them now, and I could protect myself better now. I was a long time in recovering, 4 months. Plastic surgery and the best of care gave me a face that seemed strange to me. I didn't recognize it even after they'd finished restoring my sight. It was the face of a new man because the old one had been eaten away. They gave me metal fingers for my left hand in exchange for the hand I'd lost too. But they didn't give me a new memory. The old one still sends me into paroxysms of fear every time someone mentions the duck business. The night I died slowly by degrees comes back in all its fantastic horror, and I see the weasels again. And I remember the smell of blood and feathers. It makes me wish they'd have eaten my memory along with the rest of me. So there you have it. Weasels Rip My Flesh, 2-fisted stories from men's adventure magazines of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Some of the other authors featured in this book include Lawrence Block, Robert F. Dorr, Harlan Ellison, Robert Silverberg, and Mario Puzo. The book is edited by Robert Dice with Josh Allen Friedman and Wyatt Doyle. And you can get this in softback and hardback, available on Amazon.com or at menspulpmags.com. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, and I hope you'll return in 2 weeks to hear more vintage paperback reviews and features about authors. Take care and enjoy whatever it is you're doing.